All right, welcome to our Forest Preserve District of Kane County Volunteer Herbicide Applicator Training. We're very excited to have you all join us in this annual herbicide training. As many of you know, this is something that we now have to do each year. This herbicide training is offered in the beginning of the year. This class will actually open on January 1st. And it will have the training expire on December 31st each year. But we're really excited to have you be a part of this because while cutting is very important at our work days, without herbiciding to follow up, it simply doesn't do the control on our invasive and weeds like we'd like it to. So herbiciding is super important here at the district, and having so many workday volunteers and steward trained on herbicide usage has really helped us have more effective work days. So we really appreciate you guys coming out to do this. It is important to note that while we do offer this internal training, we do still recognize the Department of Agriculture's Illinois State Applicator and Operator license. If you have those through your work or through other volunteer service, please let us know and we are able to honor those. But we do prefer that our volunteers take our internal training. It really helps us talk kind of specifically about the plants that we like to target and how we like to target. And this year is really exciting because we are offering a new herbicide to our volunteers that's never been offered. So this is going to be a whole new training for all of our folks. And so again, this year more than ever, it's important to make sure we know what herbicide we're using, where we should use it, and the conditions where we should use it. And so we're going to have our natural resource and HR team make sure that everyone is on the same page with that. And the last thing that I will mention is that this training is just good for the Forest Preserve District of Kane County. This does not apply to other park districts or other landowners because it's an in-house training. It's something that's just good for use here in the forest preserves. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. We do have a slightly new process at the end of this training as Heather wraps up. You'll be asked to actually complete a quiz. The quiz will also include the information that's needed for your roster so that we have all the information to complete that and get your certificate from the state of Illinois. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our stewardship liaison, Heather, who has gone ahead and done some updating for this new training as of 2024. Heather, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. For those of you who have taken this training before, it's going to look really similar to what you've seen in the past when Jason did this online training. So just note that it will look similar. There is some updates, as Rob alluded to, in terms of what type of herbicide to use. So we do really wish that you listen to this video before you take the quiz. For those of you who have not seen this video before, we are going to do a lot of specific things like go through weed terminology. Why is it important to know what type of plant you're looking at when you use herbicide, what the herbicides are, how they're mixed, what we do with that. Make sure that you are able to understand an herbicide label. The labels are really important to understand as they have all of that information that you need to use when using herbicide. And then the two things you really need to keep in mind are protection from the herbicide or pesticide from yourself, as well as the environment. And then lastly, probably the most meat and potatoes part of the presentation and what you're really be interested in is the practical knowledge, what herbicide you're going to be using, where you should use it, why you should use it, and the plants that you should be targeting with it. So getting on to the word weed, what is it? Well, we use weed a lot, whether it is native or non-native. In short, it's where weeds are plants we don't want in a certain area, whether that is because they compete with desirable vegetation, they negatively affect the appearance of the site, they provide a source of weed seeds for nearby areas, they might harbor insects or diseases that are either affect desirable plants or people. They could pose fire hazards or allergies in people. So a lot of these are reasons why a plant is considered a weed. And those weeds can be non-native or they could be native plants. They're just plants that we do not want in a specific area. So as I said, weeds can be native or non-native. Typically, when we're managing here at the Forest Reserve, we're managing what we consider invasive plants, meaning that they're both non-native and their growth negatively impacts the environment, economics, or human health. And when we mention non-native plants, these are plants that are typically found elsewhere, not here in King County, Illinois, sometimes not here in the United States. They have been brought here either intentionally or unintentionally, and now their growth is impacting the native plants here or the native animals, economics, or health. Some native plants can be considered invasive or weedy, and they lead to similar management. Some non-native plants do not invade, and so using invasive and non-native interchangeably is incorrect. They aren't interchangeable. We will be using herbicide to take care of those invasive plants. The majority of them are non-native, but some of them may be native plants that are considered weedy. Knowing the life cycle of these targeted plants, these non-native, usually invasive plants, helps determine the appropriate control. So all plants are sort of put in these three buckets: annual, biennial, and perennial, and that is their different growth cycle. Knowing what plant you're trying to target and whether it's annual, biennial, or perennial will help you remove those species from the environment that you're working on. So typically, again, we're targeting non-native plants. And because they're non-native plants in the area, it's possible our native plants are missing, and those missing plants are creating low diversity in our habitat, maybe the wrong community type, hindering the plant community type we want. Usually these invasive plants, native or non-native, are only removed because they're doing that negative impact to the environment. Things like poison ivy, we might consider weedy. They are native plants, but since they aren't really impacting the environment as much, it's something that we typically don't target. So moving on to what an annual plant is, our annual plants are typically not controlled with herbicide because they don't need to be controlled with herbicide. These plants germinate, grow, seed, and die within the same year. So the annual plant that you might see, chicory, for example, here on the right, it will flower, go to seed, and that specific plant will die off. It will not regerminate. What's good for annual plants in terms of treatment is to do it as early as possible. The whole point is to make sure that these weeds do not go to seed, so they do not spread. That, again, that individual plant will not be there anymore. It will die off that year, but trying to stop it from seed. So you can use herbicide and apply it to them before they flower or produce seed. But sometimes it's just as easy as cutting off the seed head so they do not spread. And that way you wouldn't need to use herbicide for those plants. And we typically don't target a lot of annual plants because if you are in a diverse prairie ecosystem, a diverse grassland, the typical perennial plants of that site will then outcompete them, and they end up sort of diminishing over time. Biennial plants, as the name kind of suggests, they require 2 years to complete their life cycle. So in the first season, the seed will germinate, and the plant usually consumes a different growth habit than the mature plant. So it'll kind of look like a rosette form. You can see that on the left picture of the screen of this garlic mustard. So it'll look a little bit different that first year. It will overwinter, and then in the second growing season, so starting in the spring, it will start to produce stems like you see in the second picture, and then it will flower, it will set seed, and then it will die back. So by the time that it sets seeds, that individual plant will no longer be living the next year, but it will have a lot of seeds that it will propagate for years to come. So biennials are typically broadleaf plants. They're not grasses. We do use herbicide to try to treat them, typically in the rosette stage, that first year stage, or in the second year stage right before it starts to go to seed. So garlic mustard is an example of a biennial. Teasel is an example of a biennial. Sometimes it's easier just to pull these plants right before they set seed in that second year. But a lot of times they may blanket an area and be too difficult to just pull. So that's when herbicide really comes in and really helps to knock back the plants that are considered biennial. Our perennial plants, that's the last sort of bucket of growth cycles these plants can come in. These are plants that live for 2 or more years. They could be herbaceous, they could be woody. They are grasses as well as herbaceous broadleaf plants. So in this case, perennials are usually the most difficult to control, and they need herbicide to really help knock back that population. Using a herbicide that is translocated throughout the entire plant. It is systemic, meaning that it targets every part of the plant, is the most efficient method for eradicating these perennials. And in the picture here, you see buckthorn, you see reed canary grass, you see purple loosestrife. Those are our plants that really need to be controlled with herbicide, unless you have such little that you can pull, but it's very unlikely. They're really tough to control just by pulling alone. So herbicide is really needed for these plants. Now, I went through talking about herbicide, why we need it. I even put out words like translocated and systemic and things that you may not have heard before. So now we're going to move into what are these herbicides? What does it mean when I talk about what an herbicide is? What do we do in the Natural Resources Department before we give them to our volunteers to use? And how do they impact plants? So in short, herbicides are a type of pesticide. A pesticide is a chemical designed to control or kill a certain species. So in herbicide, it's designed to control, kill, and prevent plants from growing. Whereas an insecticide is targeting insects, a rodenticide, rodents, etc. Within a specific herbicide, and there's plenty of different options, and within really any pesticide, there are 2 types of ingredients, an active ingredient and an inert ingredient. So the active ingredient is that chemical that's targeting the plant or other pest. In this example that I'm giving you, it's glyphosate. You see glyphosate in Roundup, Rodeo, Aquaneat. It's in a lot of different herbicides. So in this example, that active ingredient is about 53% of that jug of herbicide that you get. And the remaining part is what we call inert ingredients. And these inert ingredients do not have the direct impact on the target pest. The active ingredient is what is impacting the pest, and the inert ingredients are just what it's mixed with. So a lot of times it can be water that it's mixed with within that bottle, depending on the type of herbicide or pesticide that you get. But it's really just a carrier for that chemical, that active ingredient that's targeting that species. So we'll be talking about herbicides, and herbicides are a type of pesticide. There are a wide variety and classifications of herbicide. These things you don't really need to worry about in your own sort of volunteer role. It's something that the Natural Resources Department is looking at when they pick herbicides. And so it's really good to be able to tell myself or Jason or someone else when you're going to get an herbicide, what you're trying to do with it, what plant you're trying to kill, when you're trying to kill it. All of these information will help us understand what herbicide to give. So herbicides can be selective or they can be non-selective. And so you probably kind of understand what that means. Selective means that it's targeting specific plants. You can have a grass selective herbicide. You can have a broadleaf selective herbicide, meaning that you can put a broadleaf herbicide on a broadleaf plant and it's not going to impact the grasses that might be around it. So having selective herbicides are really useful, but they are also very expensive, so they're not used as often. There's also non-selective herbicides that will just kill anything, any plant that it touches, glyphosate being one of those. It's really effective that way because it can be used for woody plants, broadleaf plants, and grasses. It doesn't have that selectivity. There are herbicides that are considered systemic, and there are ones that are contact-based. We will be using just systemic herbicides. These travel through the entire plant. They kill it in its entirety for the roots, the shoots, and the leaves. So they are completely killed throughout the plant, whereas a contact herbicide only kills what it touches. So if you just put it on a stem, it'll kill the stem. It won't kill the roots. If you put it on the leaf, it'll only kill the leaf and not anything else. We're only using systemic herbicides. Contact herbicides can be used if you want to chemically prune a species, but that is not something that we will be doing. The herbicide can also be considered persistent, and these persistent levels vary depending on the herbicide. If you have a less persistent herbicide, that's better for the environment, meaning that it will degrade really quickly. It won't impact the environment as much, but it's likely not going to be effective in killing the plant. So if you use an herbicide that's not as persistent in the environment, that's great, but it could be detrimental to what you're trying to do. It may not kill the plant completely, so you have to sort of make that balancing role in terms of the persistence of that type of herbicide. Herbicides are considered either pre-emergent or post-emergent. We will only be using post-emergent herbicide. That means that you will use it after the plant emerges from the ground, after it germinates. That's when it will be used to target that species. Some people might use pre-emergent herbicide to blanket soil and hope that it impacts the germination of the weed seeds that are left in the soil. And then lastly, there are two different methods that herbicide works, either by impacting the growth hormone of the plant or the meristemic, or it inhibits the meristem of that plant. Both are really truly impacting the growth of the plant, but you do have to figure out, and by we, I mean the Natural Resources Department will need to figure out which one is better for different types. As you can see here, the Garlon that we give out is impacting the growth hormone of the plant, and the Roundup is a meristem inhibitor. There are also many different types of formulations. Again, something that the Natural Resources Department has to understand and figure out. Not so much impacts our volunteers, but it's really good to have this baseline knowledge when you're thinking about herbicide, especially when you're applying it. So herbicide can come in a dry formulation, whether that's a powder, a granule, a pellet. It's not as common, but what's good about it is that it doesn't freeze if it gets too cold. It could still present issues to the person mixing the herbicide because you can, and it is an inhalation hazard, and you do have to make sure you mix it really well in whatever base that you're using, whether it's water or oil, to make sure it's completely emulsified and usable. And then lastly, there are wet formulations. Wet formulations are what we're using in the Natural Resources Department. You do have to keep them from freezing, but they're much easier to mix and make sure that anytime you apply the herbicide, you're applying it in the correct concentration. Unlike if you do not mix a dry powder, you might get more concentrated at the bottom and less concentrated at when we get herbicides into the department, they do have to be mixed before they are given to our volunteers. And we think about these different things when mixing them to make sure that they're sufficiently used for our volunteers or for the staff members. So whether it is wet or dry, it still needs to be mixed to the correct concentration, either in a base of water, if we think of glyphosate products, or oil when we're thinking about our Garlon herbicide. We add dyes to the herbicide so you can see where you're applying them. So that blue dye that you get in the buckthorn blasters actually is added by us specifically, so you know where you're applying the herbicide. Typically, the herbicide does not come in already dyed. And then there are specific things that are added to this stage to help the application of the herbicide. So Typically, we'll add a surfactant to our glyphosate herbicide, which helps reduce the tension of the spray droplet. So when the droplet goes on the leaf surface, there's a lot less tension. It's easier for that plant to absorb that herbicide. There's also things like stickers that help increase the adhesiveness of it. There are drift reduction additives to make sure the droplet size is large enough to reduce drift, meaning the air moving the herbicide away from its target plant. There's also things like penetrants to help penetrate into the leaf, especially if the leaf has a really waxy cuticle, and then buffer agents that are what we consider water softening agents that are used to reduce any problems used with using hard water when you mix herbicides together. Again, these aren't things that you'll necessarily need to know, but realize that when we get an herbicide into the Natural Resources Department, myself, Jason, or another staff member will be mixing it all together at a specific concentration with a specific dye and a specific adjuvant for your case. So knowing why you're using it and where you're using it is really important so we can dial it in and make sure that herbicide is effective for your specific problem. When you get an herbicide, they come with a label, and these labels are really, really important to understand. And I'll be walking through a label briefly through this presentation so you can understand what information is given to you. These labels will be posted on our website for you to use for all of the 3 herbicides that we're going to be giving out. Note that we used to use Rodeo and Roundup Custom for the glyphosate-based herbicide. We are now using Aquaneat. Aquaneat has the same concentration of active and inactive ingredient that Roundup Custom did. It's just a different sort of name and supplier for that particular glyphosate-based herbicide. You'll still be able to use Garlon 4, and then we added Transline to the mix, and I'll talk later about what Transline can be used for and when it should be used. Note that these labels will be posted on the volunteer resources part of our website, so you can read them and go through them. But if you want to see them beforehand, please let myself, Jason, or Rob know, and we can get them to you. So these labels will tell you what type of pesticide that specific brand is. There are general use pesticides, and there's also restricted use pesticides. So general use pesticides are one that you can actually buy in a store. You do not need a certification to apply specifically onto your own property. We will be using general use pesticides, but the reason why you need a certification to use it is because it's on someone else's property. It's on Forest Preserve property. The other group of pesticides are considered restricted use pesticides. You'll need an actual applicator license through the state to be able to use them. These are very rarely used in our field because they can cause great harm to people and the environment if not used properly, which is why we stick to general use pesticides. The other information you can find on a product label includes the type of pesticide, whether it's herbicide, miticide, fungicide, its formula and concentration. You'll see those active ingredients versus the inert ingredients. It will tell you how you should apply it, where you should apply it, and when to apply it, which is really important. It will also tell you its impact on wildlife and people, how long you should wait before entering a treated area, as well as the appropriate personal protective equipment when handling that pesticide. So all of this is really important to understand before you use the herbicide. Now, I want to take a pause here to say that even if you buy at, let's say, Home Depot, you go buy your own herbicide for your own use at your own home, it's really good that every time you purchase something, you're reading the label, as labels do change and get updated over time. So when we order new pesticide, we're also reading the labels and making sure that the label is the same. Nothing has changed with the formulation of that particular herbicide. to make sure that it's going to have the same impact that we want and everyone is as safe as they need to be. So it's really important that you do read the product label anytime you get a new herbicide. So again, that label is going to tell you what type of pest the product can control, herbicide, insecticide, miticide, fungicide, it'll all be there. It will also say what the brand name is. And we'll likely be using the brand name when we talk about these different herbicides, but note that brand names are just trademark names. Sometimes products with similar brand names might have different active ingredients. Sometimes different brand names may have the same ingredients. Sometimes those ingredients might be in a different formulation. Sometimes they might be in a similar formulation, meaning the active ingredient percentage is the same as the inactive ingredient percentage, but the inactive ingredients might be different and it may not say that outright. So when I talk about glyphosate, Roundup is a glyphosate-based herbicide, Rodeo is, Aquaneat, Roundup Custom are all different formulations of the same herbicide. Again, we'll be using Aquaneat from now on, not Roundup Custom, but has the same percentage of active ingredient versus inactive ingredient in it. It will also have what we call signal words. Signal words are important to understand because they tell you how toxic that herbicide is to you. We will only use herbicides that are caution labeled, so they're slightly toxic. We will not be using ones that are warning or danger without letting you know, and that determines how toxic that herbicide is to you. Besides toxicity, it'll also tell you what to do, the label will, in an emergency situation. How to clean up a spill, how to flush out your eyes, wash your clothes, wipe it off your skin, whatever you need to do in those types of situations, which is why it's very important to read the label and understand it so you know those emergency procedures if they do arise. Another part about knowing the herbicide is a safety data sheet. This is a separate thing from the label. It gives more in-depth information about that chemical, how hazardous it is, the fire and explosion danger, first aid issues, product reactivity, all of these information is all going to be in the safety data sheet. We keep these on file and are readily available if you would like to read through them for any of the herbicides that are being used. A lot of times the safety data sheet is not necessary to consume as a user of the herbicide. A lot of times these are primarily used by first responders in cases of large spills, but it's really important just to sort of get to know it and understand what might be there. And this might be something that's asked of us to give to first responders in case of a large spill. In those safety data sheets, you will also see a hazardous materials identification system. This is a diamond-shaped pattern with these 4 different squares determining flammability, instability, health concerns, and special concerns of whatever herbicide you're using. And within that, that diamond shaped in each of those squares, you might see any number between 0 to 4. 0 meaning there might be a minimal hazard. So if it was 0 on that red square, it would be a minimal hazard of flammability, and then 4 would be a severe hazard. So definitely read the labels. You might want to get familiar with the safety data sheets, especially if you're using herbicide a lot within your site, just so you are aware of those issues that herbicide might have. All right, moving on, we're going to talk about what a label looks like, and we're going to be specifically looking at Rodeo as the example for the specimen, so you can get to know this type of herbicide. So I'm going to go through this quickly as it's pretty self-explanatory when you read through it. Just sort of point out these specific parts that you'll be seeing when you look at the labels yourself. So the first is the trade name. This is the specific formulation of that herbicide. This is Rodeo. It could be Aquaneat, it could be Garlon. And then you'll see below the chemical name, which is the active ingredient in the formula, which in this case is glyphosate. It will then show you the concentration of that glyphosate, which although the active ingredient is 53% within the bottle, it will tell you in terms of what concentration was used to get to that 53%. It'll also give you the EPA registration number. These are specific numbers to each of these herbicides. They all have to be registered through the EPA. Not something you're going to need to spit out when you're using the herbicide itself, but something a first responder might need to look at if they are trying to help clean up a spill of specific herbicide. On the right side, you'll see the personal protective equipment that you need to be wearing. These are the requirements that you need to meet when you're applying this particular herbicide. If something goes amiss and you get injured by using this, they're going to want to know, the company specifically will need to know whether or not you're wearing that personal protective equipment the way that they have written down. If you are not, then that is your own fault, and they are not responsible for any of that. So it's definitely required to be using that baseline personal protective equipment when using herbicide. The herbicide will also have a description. It tells you what type of species, what locations, where it's legal to apply this herbicide. If you apply it outside of these requirements that are listed on the label, then you would be responsible for any of that injury. So you do need to follow all of the written parts of this label. It will also say the hazard statement, which is these are the signal words for the herbicide. In this case, rodeo is just a caution. So again, volunteers, we're only going to have you apply herbicide labeled as caution. So they're on the lower end of the hazard risk, but they're not necessarily non-hazardous chemicals. All right, next we have the contact information for the manufacturer. This is something that would be used in case of health or environmental emergency. You'll also have things like general information, how the herbicide works, whether it inhibits the growth of the plant or the meristem of the plant, how long it might take to see visible signs of the herbicide being used, and it will also tell you in which conditions you can treat it. Make sure in the case of rodeo, when you should apply it when it's going to rain or not rain, how hot it should be, all of those information will be there. Again, there are going to be more caution statements. These are helpful to make sure you know to avoid unintended injury to desirable plants. Some cases, herbicides might volatilize, and we'll talk about that soon, but that means that you might apply it to one plant. If conditions are right, it might impact all the plants around it that you weren't targeting and kill those as well. So make sure to follow those cautionary statements when applying the herbicide. There's also going to be a chart on here to determine the amount needed for different solution strength. This is not something you'll need to know, but something that we would look at if we're mixing the herbicide for your specific case. If you want to do a full year treatment versus a cut stem, knowing what you're doing will help us determine what percentage needs to be mixed and given out. It will also tell you the recommendations for control of specific plants, as well as what type of plants are going to be targeted with this particular herbicide. So again, making sure that we're going through each of them. In some cases, they may give specific control recommendations for certain species. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in rodeo here, and it targets a lot of things, so it may be a longer label than some of the selective herbicides. Here on page 11, it'll tell you wetland and aquatic information for rodeo. This is really important. A lot of the herbicides do not want to be applied or need to be applied near water, as they might leach into the water table and that kind of thing. So making sure how far away from an aquatic site you can apply it is really important. as well as any other site-specific control recommendations. So the label is a lot of information. I know I went through it really fast, mostly because a lot of these things are self-explanatory, and you should be able to understand what the requirements are when you do read it. Some information you can skim over, like this one about tank mixtures. None of our volunteers are going to be mixing an entire tank of herbicide. We will be providing the herbicide for you, but if you were ever in that case for your profession, this would be a place to look for those specific herbicide labels sites. Same thing with the wetland site information. Just let us know what you're doing and where you are, and we can probably provide you that information. But it's really good to be familiar with the herbicide and where it can be applied in terms of how far can you be from a wetland or near water. Mostly volunteers will be using cut stump treatments, and this helps you determine what type of cut stump treatment in terms of methods for application and when it should be applied. That will help as well. But all of this information is something that Jason and the Natural Resources Department take into account already before they order the herbicide. So if we're giving you Aquanit, that glyphosate for cut stump application, it's something that they're already using for it. We already know that it's going to work well for your specific case. So just be familiar with those labels, and hopefully they'll be on our website soon enough so you can go through those new labels. With that, the one thing that I find the most important on these labels for our volunteers is how to protect yourself from the herbicide that you're using. And it's one of the two things that you need to be aware of when you're using herbicide is how do you protect yourself from any negative impacts that herbicide might have. So it'll tell you what PPE to use, how to maintain your PPE to minimize your exposure to that pesticide and maximize its effectiveness. So it's not on yourself, it's actually on the plant. So when you talk about exposure to any pesticide, herbicide being one, you have to look at the hazard that herbicide might cause to yourself. And the hazard is the product of your exposure risk and the toxicity of that herbicide. Your exposure risk is how your pesticide might enter the body. So if you're covered up, you should be lowering your exposure when you use that herbicide. And then the toxicity is how poisonous that herbicide or pesticide is to you, and you can figure out that that toxicity level by that signal word. So caution is being the one that all of the herbicides that our volunteers will use will have. So it'll have the lower end of the toxicity, but not completely non-toxic. In terms of exposure, there are 4 different ways that you can be exposed to this herbicide: through your skin, so dermally, through your mouth, so orally, inhalation of that herbicide, and then through your eyes as well. These exposure routes can happen at any period in time when you're handling the herbicide, applying it, mixing it, and loading it. So we decrease your risk of exposure by doing all of the mixing of the herbicide for you, but you're still handling it, applying it, and loading it in and out of your car. So there's still a risk of that pesticide exposure in one of those 4 ways. The first being dermal exposure. So dermal exposure is exposure of skin. So if you're not wearing gloves, you're not wearing long sleeves, you get it splashed on yourself, or maybe you might have a little bit of a gap between your sleeve and your glove, and it's just right there. Those are ways of getting herbicide through to your skin. If you do so, make sure you're rinsing with water, you remove any contaminated clothing, and you wash those areas with plenty soap and water. In this diagram here, it shows you the different rates at which your skin might absorb the herbicide. And it's 4 times as fast if you get it on your scalp, 11 times in the genital area, 2 times in the abdomen. So there's areas of skin that'll absorb that herbicide more than others. So knowing that will determine your exposure, but hopefully we're all wearing our PPE and won't have to worry about that. But if we do, water, washing that area with soap and water, removing that contaminated clothing will be key. In terms of oral exposure, this is exposure of the mouth. Rinse your mouth out with water. Do not induce vomiting. Make sure you're calling a healthcare provider, if necessary, 911, depending on the type of exposure. And this is usually the only issue, the only time you'll have that oral exposure is if you remove the herbicide from its original container and put it in a food container, like a drink bottle or a milk jug. And kids might see this and think that's a good drink to have if it's not labeled and put away so they can't get to it. So oral exposure should not be very common as long as we're leaving the pesticides in their original containers. Inhalation exposure is another potential. This is exposure to the lungs from breathing in the herbicide or the fumes of the herbicide. Getting to fresh air, make sure you loosen any tight clothing, keep your air passages clean. This is not something I'm expecting any of our volunteers to have, but it is an exposure risk you might. A lot of times inhalation exposure is from mixing the herbicide, especially mixing it in an enclosed area. Lastly, it's eye exposure. This is something that might be as common as dermal or skin exposure because splashing might occur if you're pouring the herbicide from a large bottle into a small one, like a buckthorn blaster. So if this is the case, just make sure you're washing your eye with a gentle stream of water, 15 or more minutes, making sure you get medical attention if there's any issue with that. And all of that information, all that PPE, and anything that you need to do first aid wise will be on that label. But really, it is best to get to a medical professional if that's the case. If exposed yourself or any of the volunteers, stop that exposure, rinse with clean water, read and follow those label directions as I mentioned, and make sure you see a doctor and bring in the pesticide label. If any of this occurs, I, myself, or Rob needs to know, and we can make sure we're following the correct route on our end. But if we're all wearing the protective equipment that I'm hoping you're all wearing, we should not have any of these issues. This personal protective equipment includes things like boots and gloves and face shields, depending on what type of application that you're using it. And honestly, it helps to prevent exposure. It's not here to make you look fashionable. It's really just to make sure that you're safe when applying these herbicides. So herbicides are chemicals, and when they're used appropriately, they're really effective tools in reducing the non-native species in our forest preserves. So again, an effective PPE barrier is going to be when you choose the right equipment, clean and maintain it correctly, use it correctly, and make sure it protects your skin, eyes, and lungs. All of this is very important. So you might be thinking what to wear. You might already know what to wear, but to protect your eyes, the law requires you to at least follow the labeling instructions of the herbicide. So these might be a little bit different depending on the herbicide. But if there is no label, you do have to use good judgment. If you were a commercial applicator, you would be required to wear long pants, long sleeve shirt, gloves, and protective footwear. And that's to help protect your eyes and your skin from, from getting herbicide exposure. So to protect your eyes, wearing goggles, a face shield, safety glasses, should already be wearing safety glasses if you're cutting woody plants out of the forest reserve. To protect your skin, making sure you're wearing long plants. Chemical resistant gloves are important, whether that be rubber or nitrile, as well as wearing things like work boots. Optional, you can be wearing a long sleeved shirt. Probably should be wearing that anyway. Rubber boots or a hat to help try to decrease the exposure to your head if that happens. So rubber boots are optional and typically used if you're applying a lot of herbicide, because even though the work boots might be leather and they might not have that herbicide penetrate through it, you might be applying so much that it might do that. So making sure wearing rubber boots is very important. You can wear work leather gloves when applying herbicide. We'd rather be wearing chemical resistant gloves. Really depends on the method of herbicide application. When you're using buckthorn blasters, you're rarely getting any, if anything at all, on your hand. So less likely for that exposure through your hand than you would if you were applying it with a spray gun or doing foliar spraying. So different routes of application may determine what type of PPE, but you really should be wearing the ones that are listed on this slide. With having good PPE measure, you do have to decontaminate any materials that might get in contact with the herbicide. So keeping things like clean water, soap, paper towels, extra coveralls, so extra clothing, eye wash, and at the very minimum, a first aid kit that all of our stewards get is a must to have on you during your workday when you're using herbicide, or at least near you if you're at home and storing it or putting it in buckthorn blasters. Having all of that is really going to help make sure that the material being touched by herbicide can also be clean. When you're done with the workday and have used herbicide before, washing your hands and face with hot soap and water is going to help. Making sure you're not eating, drinking, or smoking after you used herbicide. Shower and change clothes when possible. Again, always a must to make sure, even if you don't think you touched herbicide, if you're even around it or applying it, best to have your hands washed and your face washed before doing any of those three things: eating, drinking, or smoking. Washing contaminated clothing is going to be a must as well after they're used. You should wash them separately from any other clothing that you might have. Try to use hot water if possible and a heavy duty liquid detergent to make sure that all of that is clean, but make sure that the manufacturer, so that label specifies that type of washing. It might need to be completely thrown out depending on the herbicide. Not that I'm saying that you will need to do that yourself, but that label will specify how to wash clothing if it is infected with that pesticide or herbicide. And then lastly, if you're using things like reusable gloves, like rubber gloves when applying herbicide, or rubber boots, make sure you're checking for rips and leaks during the cleanup of those items, similar to what's shown in this picture, because any nick or hole within those gloves might allow that herbicide to come into your skin. So making sure that is all perfect and not leaking is going to be key as well. And then if you do have, when you do have gloves on or boots on, and they may have had herbicide on them, make sure you're removing them as carefully as you can. Maybe wash them before you remove them. That might be easier. Making sure they're washed outside instead of inside might help decrease the spread of that herbicide from the glove to the sink to someone else that might use that sink too. So making sure your PPE is in proper shape and it is cleaned, and you're not contacting herbicide-laden gear with your bare hands is going to be really important. When it comes to disposing of pesticide containers, make sure they're returned to the district for disposal. For those who are not familiar, we use this brown box to the left of the Natural Resources Department door. That's where all the pesticide containers that are empty can go in for us to take them and dispose them ourselves, or when full herbicide goes out. So we try to keep them in buckets to help make sure the herbicide doesn't leak into the box itself, but do not dispose of any of those empty containers on your own. We would like to take them back. We'll dispose of them for you, but most likely we're going to be reusing them, as they're really key in keeping that plastic pollution down. When you store pesticides at home, make sure that you lock the pesticide storage. You store them in the original containers with the label intact, and do not store them in food bottles, soft drink bottles, food containers, because we're trying to decrease the risk of this herbicide to children or other people who might not be familiar with what it is. All right, next we're going to move briefly on to environmental protection, and then we'll talk about the nuts and the bolts that we're all here about to know what herbicides you can use and what you can use them for. So not only thinking about yourself, you do need to think about the environment when using herbicides. If they're not used correctly, you could negatively impact the area that you're working on and not positively impact the area that you're working on. So, go back. Pesticides can be moved off target in 3 different methods, whether that's wind, water, or on objects. And those objects can be your own boots. They could be plants and animals moving through the site. It can be moved off target just by that contact. In terms of air, we're the most worried about a thing called drift. And drift is when the pesticide moves away from the target by the air. And each pesticide will vary in its potential to have that drift. It's not as big of an issue with cut stump treatment as much as it is a foliar spray of the herbicide. But knowing the weather conditions at that site when you're putting on that herbicide will tell you if it is going to, in fact, be drifted away from the target location. Things like small droplet size from a high pressure spray, wind or air currents that might be a bit too high when you're putting on the herbicide, as well as spraying of far distance from your target will increase the risk of drift, meaning that the air takes the herbicide away from the target species and puts it on other plants that might be in the area. So all of the information on the label should help you decrease drift from that herbicide. In this case, we using a lot of buckthorn blasters and don't have to worry about that, or hand sprayers. So keeping it really close to the target plant will help decrease the likelihood of drift. A type of drift is called vapor drift, and this is when an herbicide volatilizes. And this has been a really important thing that a lot of people who are using herbicide have been thinking about lately. This is when your herbicide that you're spraying not only physically drifts away to a different plant, but actually that liquid turns into a vapor. You cannot see it, and then through the air, it will move elsewhere. And because it's so fine, it might move a really far distance away. And so you could be spraying a plant, and then hundreds of yards away, it might be actually coming onto a plant you do not want to spray. A lot of herbicides will have on their label, if it's going to be an herbicide you're going to have to be cognizant of increased vapor drift. And Garlon 4 is one of them. Garlon 4 is an herbicide you're able to use, but if the temperature is really high, it will volatilize when you're spraying it on a certain plant. And if you even spray it on a stump or put it on a stump, it could potentially kill the nearby trees. It's very effective in what it does. So making sure that the herbicide, you're following the label when you're applying the herbicide, will help decrease that impact to the environment. Another way that the herbicide can get into the environment is through runoff, water through runoff. And so this is when rain kind of goes over the surface of an area that might have been treated, and then that contaminated water then moves into whether it's a stream, a pond, a lake. And usually you can avoid any of that issue with water surface runoff. You follow the label instructions and you make sure that rain is not going to follow that initial herbicide treatment. So as long as it stays dry, you won't have to worry about the herbicide running off into the stream, as it will just be absorbed into the plant. Runoff, again, is most likely when the herbicide is applied to a sloping site, when with saturated soils, maybe it's near a compacted or paved surface, and the spills are not cleaned up. That would be if you did this right before a rainstorm. You're not going to have to worry about it as much if it's not going to rain nearby. Lastly, for water, we have things like leaching that you might have to be cognizant of. Again, making sure that it's not raining near the time that you apply the herbicide. And so leaching is not it running over the surface into the water, it's actually leaching into the soil and eventually into the water table. Again, this isn't highly a concern for us, but it is a possibility if you're using a lot of herbicide, whether it's over-applied, whether you're in a sandy soil. Some pesticide properties lead to leaching being easier than some others, whether you apply it before heavy rain or you don't clean up spills. So following the label instructions will help minimize all of this, whether it's impact to yourself or impact to the environment. And so to help make sure that this doesn't happen in terms of protecting our water resources, just make sure you're checking the weather, delay application if heavy rain is going to be in the area. Definitely don't have a work day using herbicide if you see weather like this. And honestly, you probably shouldn't be having a work day if you see weather like this. So being cognizant when your herbicide is applied is going to help decrease what any non-target impacts, whether it's through the air or through the water. And so the third thing was movement of pesticides on objects. And so an object can be yourself, it can be your clothes, it could be your shoes, which is why decontaminating yourself before you do anything important, like pick up your kids, is going to be really, really, really important. So taking off your shoes before you go inside, washing your clothes separately from other clothing is going to help minimize the movement of pesticides on objects. Now, I know that this is an environmental slide, so maybe it seems a little out of place, but that pesticide might also stick to animal fur. Anything walking through the area might get it. You're not going to be as concerned about that with what we're using and how little herbicide we're using, but just make sure that if the label of the herbicide says you should not go back into an area after X amount of hours, then maybe you shouldn't have the group back there within that time to make sure that that herbicide can dry up during that area. All right, our final section is our practical knowledge. I'll be spending a lot more time on the herbicide chart than some of the other things, like target species, since a lot of you already know what to do. But this is going to be the meat and potatoes, all of the things that you'll need to know about herbicide and the herbicides you're allowed to use, including our new herbicide that we've added to the program. So this herbicide use chart is going to be used for you to determine what you might need when you ask myself or Jason for herbicide. So there are 3 types that you can use, and each have different application methods. If you are unsure what to use, again, ask us, let us know what you're doing, and we'll be able to provide you the right herbicide for your particular use case, as well as if you need any different applicators or personal protective equipment, we can help as well. So the first change, again, is we're not using Rodeo or Roundup Custom anymore. We're using the glyphosate herbicide called Aquaneat. When we get the Aquaneat and give it to you, we'll first mix it with water to the right concentration. We're going to dye it blue, and you're able to use it on woody plants, herbaceous plants, using a cut stump treatment or a foliar spray treatment. And this is the only one that you can use in wetlands, but make sure that you do not use it if precipitation is expected within 4 hours, so we don't get any leaching or surface runoff issues. The second herbicide is brand new to the program. It's the herbicide trans line. This is a specific herbicide. It is not a sort of herbicide that can be used for any different plant. It is broadleaf specific. It's also going to be mixed with water. It is going to be dyed blue. You cannot use it for woody plants because, again, it is broadleaf specific. So no woody plants, no grasses, but you can use it on these species and these species only. Bird's foot trefoil, crown vetch, spotted knapweed, teasel, and thistle. So those are the only species we want you to use transline on. Again, it's not cut stump usable because it is a broadleaf specific herbicide. And again, you'll need to use that in a foliar spray. You cannot use it near wetlands. Make sure precipitation is not expected within 2 hours to decrease that leaching. And I want to mention again that it is broadleaf specific and only for those herbaceous plants. It is an expensive herbicide, but it's really useful in getting rid of those really hard to get rid of invasive species, the BFT, the crown vetch, spotted knapweed, teasel, and thistle. And then lastly, we have Garlon 4. That is an oil-based herbicide, so the only one that is mixed with oil and not with water when you get it. It's going to be dyed red. It is for woody plants and woody plants only. You cannot use it on herbaceous plants, so you can only use the cut stump treatment for Garlon 4. And then in this one, make sure you don't expect precipitation within 4 hours to decrease that runoff and leaching. Do not use it over 80 degrees Fahrenheit to decrease its volatilization. And then don't use it in wet or snowy conditions because it will easily leach in around the plant and provide what we know as the ring of death around that specific one. So you'll be able to effectively treat the target species, but then everything else growing around it if you're applying it incorrectly in that wet and snowy environment. So this is a really good chart for you to look at and think about when you're trying to get rid of these certain invasive species, but realize that Jason and I are here to help you with any of that information, whether you need to know what type of herbicide you want to use, how to use it. We will be providing different concentrations of each of these herbicides depending on your use case. So making sure we know that will also make sure that you get the correct concentration. Because if you need a low concentration of the herbicide for your specific use case and we give you a high one, you're going to have a lot of off-target effects that we're also trying to avoid. So I'm going to briefly go through the different types of application methods that I just mentioned. The first being cut stump. This is only used on woody plants in the late growing season and winter, and is very ineffective in the summer, especially when the sap is rising. So please only use it in the late growing season and in the winter. This treatment you can use with Aquaneat or Garlon 4. This is typically at a 30% concentration. The minimal amount is always the best, and it shows immediate progress. So Aquaneat can be applied, must be applied immediately after the stump is cut. You can use a buckthorn blaster or hand sprayer at a low pressure to avoid overspray. And you should be applying that around the living cambium in an outer ring. As you can see in this photo, that blue area is the glyphosate herbicide. It is only around the outer ring. You do not need to apply it on the whole stump. If you applied it on the whole stump, it would just be a waste of herbicide. Only around that ring is where it's going to be absorbing. If you're using Garlon 4, you should do it along the whole surface as well as down the edges of the stump. That way it will be able to absorb effectively. It is an oil base, so it's a little bit different, and kill that target species. It is okay to apply Aquaneat to the whole surface of the cut stump if it is under 2 inches. So you don't have to go really, really, really fine around the edges. You can just apply it to the whole surface, but usually if the stump is less than 2 inches. The other application method is foliar spraying. You can foliar spray on herbaceous or woody plants, and by foliar spray, I mean spraying herbicide on the leaves of the plant and not any of the cut surfaces. This is only to be used, obviously, when the plants are in full leaf, so in the growing season. You'd be using a concentration of Aquaneat lower than what you would use for cut stump, so letting us know if you're doing foliar or cut stump. It was will be appreciated, even though they are in different seasons, so we should have a good idea. To do so, you will use a hand sprayer, but it should be at a low pressure and directed spray at the plant to avoid any drift concerns. And make sure that the leaves are wet well, but they're not dripping, because dripping can be a source of runoff for that plant. Another method is hand wicking. It's not as commonly used, but it sometimes is effective on herbaceous narrow-leaved plants, so that would be cattails or reed canary grass. You use a low concentration of aquanite. This uses minimal herbicide, but it's labor intensive. And for those who don't know what hand wicking is, you can kind of see it in this photo. This person has a pair of rubber gloves on. They're soaking a sponge of herbicide on their hand, and they're using their hand to wick up the plant. Again, it's useful to target different narrow-leaved plants, but it is quite labor intensive for that specific job. The target species that our volunteers will be looking at are both woody and herbaceous invasive species. Some native species that are weedy with permission only. Pulling is an appropriate method if you're able to get all the roots. So if you don't want to use herbicide all the time, you don't have to. And then ask us if you're unsure what herbicide to use and what method to use. The most common treatment for our woody species is going to be a cut stump method, cutting it flush to the ground, applying the herbicide as I just mentioned. And then here I'm going to go through really quickly samples of what you might encounter these non-native woody species to target. If you're unsure of what a species is, we can help. We can also show you ways of trying to identify them yourself in the field. But most of the herbicide treatment you'll do will probably be on woody species within your site. So buckthorn is a non-native species. There's multiple different types of buckthorn. They all look very similar. And they're going to be growing quite densely and sometimes in very, very large stumps. You're going to have honeysuckle. Honeysuckle is, again, a lot of different species. They're large bush, very dense wood, pretty easy to identify, especially since they hold their leaves throughout the winter. You'll have things like autumn olive, another non-native shrub. Sometimes there might be Russian olive, but I believe most of these species are going to be autumn olive. Again, another non-native shrub, woody shrub to be able to cut flush to the ground, and then herbicide. Tree of Heaven is another one that kind of looks like sumac, but kind of out of control. That's how I try to identify it. Another one to be targeting at your site. Black locust is actually a native plant, but it is quite weedy and something that we are okay if you try to target at your specific sites. Burning bush is only a problem at some sites, not in others. If any of these shrubs are really small, including burning bush, you might actually be able to pull them out of the ground and not necessarily need to cut them and treat them. Privet is another invasive woody plant that you might find at your site, but it is not very prevalent, so maybe not as much than buckthorn and honeysuckle, which are quite common. Multiflora rose is a non-native rose to the area. There are native roses, so make sure you know how to identify this one compared to the others. A lot of times it's really obvious because it grows into this sort of giant, very thorny bush that is much different than sort of the lower profile native roses that we have. Another woody plant, a vine, is called Oriental Bittersweet, another non-native plant that you can see vining up trees and sometimes strangling them to the point that that tree dies. And it's really crazy to look at, but it is one to be paying attention to. And that ends the woody plants. This is a subset of things you might find, but probably the most common. I'm going to move on to herbaceous species. I'm going to go probably even faster through that because the majority of our herbaceous species are primarily being targeted by staff. They spend quite a bit of time during the growing season mapping out these non-native herbaceous plants and getting them themselves. When you're targeting them yourself, you're going to either do foliar spray or hand wicking, but it may be better to pull or leave for staff. And if you find populations of them, just in case, let us know so we're aware of them if we are not aware of them. There's quite a lot in different forest preserves, so making sure we're aware of each different population is important. Listed again are a subset of what you might encounter, not all of it. And if you're unsure of what species, we can help. So there's going to be Canada thistle, that is a non-native species to target, one that the district will mow more than it will spray. So if you see some Canada thistle, don't feel like you need to spray it, just let us know that it's there. Chervil is another herbaceous plant that you might see. It is a biennial plant, just like garlic mustard, and even more like garlic mustard. It blooms really early in the season, so it needs to be treated early in the season, and one that the district will be going after the first thing in the springtime. Crown vetch is another herbaceous species that you might find in your site. It is targeted mostly by herbicide spray. And garlic mustard, you'll see a lot in our woodlands. It is a biennial species. It's most often mowed or hand pulled. And sometimes it can be really bad that the district itself needs to hire contractors to take care of it. So it's one of those things can proliferate a lot. And something that pulling, in my experience, is a lot more fulfilling than herbiciding. There's things like purple loosestrife. This is more of a wetland species. It's non-native, it's super invasive. Usually treat it in the midsummer with herbicide. Again, something that you might not want to tackle yourself, but let us know if you find. Reed canary grass is one of the only non-native grasses, one of the only non-native grasses that you might see. This can be treated in large populations, and if you have a small one, you might be able to tackle it effectively, but again, just letting us know that it's there is very important. Teasel is one that the staff spends countless hours in the early summer in almost every preserve to get rid of. It's mapped extensively. It is a biennial species, but if you see it, feel free to tackle it yourself or just let us know that it's there in your site. Spotted knapweed is another non-native invasive species. Kind of looks like thistle, but it's a little different, and one that herbicide is very useful in tackling. And then lastly, bird's foot trefoil. This is a non-native legume. The others aren't legumes. This one, herbicide works well, but it can proliferate a lot. So good to let us know if you see that in your site. Now, that was a lot to go through and hopefully not too quickly. The needing to know different terminology, what herbicide is and how it's mixed, making sure you read the label as well as knowing the human pesticide protection and the environmental pesticide protection will make sure that you're able to apply the herbicide effectively, and more importantly, that it's safe for both yourself and the environment. So please let us know, let me know, let Jason know if you have any questions about this. It is a lot to go through and a lot of information, but we want to make sure that you have all of that information in your repertoire so you can be good at effectively applying herbicide. So thank you again. I'm going to reiterate this because I think it's very important, but the use of herbicide is quite an effective tool in restoring native habitat when it's used correctly. Hopefully this training will help you apply it effectively. If you have any questions, let us know, and make sure that you click the link in the description below and take the quiz, so we know that you've watched this video and you understand it. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.